11 Facts about the life of Geronimo. Geronimo might have lived out his life as an Apache chief, following tradition and protecting the safety of his people if he had been born a few years earlier. At the tail end of America's westward expansion, one of the most famous Native Americans in history was born into a life of upheaval. True, Geronimo's life was riddled with heartbreak, but that didn't stop the brilliant tactician and charismatic commander from making history. The man who would become the Apache's most famous warrior was nurtured in a traditional manner. He was born in 1829 in what is now New Mexico. Geronimo's typical life was turned upside down in 1858, when a terrible tragedy set him on a 30-year mission to rectify the wrongs that had befallen his people. Geronimo's legacy helped raise awareness for his people's suffering in a way that few others have done before or after, even though he died as a prisoner of war in 1909. Aside from the legacy talk, this Apache warrior was someone you didn't want to mess with. Despite being outgunned and outmanned throughout his career, the Native American hero was one of the most righteously feared and universally admired warriors to ever walk onto a battlefield. Before we move to the next step, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can be updated by my new videos. Number 11. It was a Mexican raid that set Geronimo on war's path. Despite the fact that his later renown would be defined by his struggle with U.S. cavalry, it was a raid led by Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco that propelled Geronimo and his Apaches onward. While Geronimo and a band of 80 Apache warriors traded with the nearby town of Casquilla in the summer of 1858, a band of Mexican soldiers rode through the Apache camp, killed the few warriors who had stayed behind to guard the civilians, burned the camp to the ground, confiscated the Apaches' guns and horses, and then murdered the majority of the women and children. The attack was in retribution for alleged raids led by Geronimo and his Apaches against surrounding Mexican towns, a crime of which the Apaches were not guilty. Geronimo's whole family was slain as a result of the attack, including his first wife, Alope, his 3 children, and his mother. The Apaches waited over a year to gather tribes to help them retaliate. Geronimo himself went from tribe to tribe asking support, and he was extremely successful. Number 10. Geronimo was given his chance to lead because of his pain. The Apache chiefs, including the famous Chief Cochise, chose to designate Geronimo as the battle's leader as the Apache tribes assembled to avenge the massacre at Casquilla. Despite the fact that honor usually went to a chief, which Geronimo was not, it was judged that Geronimo's death was the most tragic. According to Geronimo, he led his Apache warriors against the Mexican army in a horrific 2-hour battle that saw practically every combatant on the field killed. Geronimo, who was always at the front of the combat, is said to have murdered scores of men until he was left with nothing but his knife. As he wrote in his autobiography, "Still covered with the blood of my enemies, still holding my conquering weapon, still hot with the joy of battle, victory, and vengeance, I was surrounded by the Apache braves and made war chief of all the Apaches. Then I gave orders for scalping the slain." Number 9. Geronimo once single-handedly evaded close armed pursuit for 2 days. The Apaches resumed their everyday lives after the Casquilla slaughter, attempting to put the massacre behind them. Geronimo, on the other hand, was still out for vengeance. He persuaded 2 other warriors to join him on his journey to Mexico. Geronimo's tiny band came under fire from Mexican weapons almost immediately after spotting a small settlement. Geronimo was encircled by armed soldiers after his 2 comrades were dead. Rather than fleeing and hiding, Geronimo battled his way back to Arizona on foot, surrounded by soldiers. Number 8. Geronimo was shot in the face and still got up to do battle. Geronimo spent several years early in his career getting his ass kicked by the Mexican people, despite winning his first combat. His first incursions into Sonora were badly defeated, and his troop of warriors returned empty-handed. Geronimo himself had been injured for a long time. He ran into the action during one attack on a convoy, only to slip on some blood and get crushed in the head with the butt of a Mexican soldier's gun. Geronimo's Apaches were pursued by soldiers in another nearly successful attack, and Geronimo was shot multiple times. In truth, the soldier was struck in the face during the first salvo, but he stood up and battled his way to safety. Number 7. Half of Geronimo's tribe was betrayed and killed after a deal proposed at Apache Teju. In order to strike a bargain with the white men encroaching on their area, Geronimo's tribe's chief, Mangus Colorado, proceeded to a seemingly tranquil white hamlet named Apache Teju. Mangus Colorado returned with good news. The settlers had not only consented to welcome the Apaches, but they had also promised a plethora of supplies when they arrived. Because the tribe was split on how to proceed, Mangus Colorado led half of the tribe to Apache Teju, where they were slain by US troops. Number 6. With only 3 other warriors, Geronimo secured enough supplies to last his tribe a year. Geronimo led an attack on a tiny town about 40 miles west of Casa Grande in the summer of 1863. Geronimo and his small band of soldiers snuck into town at high noon and scattered the town's inhabitants. According to Geronimo, no one in the town fought back or even chased them down. They simply noticed the Native Americans approaching, turned around, and fled. The Apaches drove 6 ponies into town and loaded up as much loot as they could carry after the town was empty. Only 1 person had been slain. Number 5. Geronimo wasn't originally keen on taking war to the white men who invaded. Around the year 1868, American troops invaded Apache country. The early settlers were mainly peaceful, and Geronimo and the Apaches lived in peace, as was America's custom. Unfortunately, a year later, under the guise of peace, numerous renowned chiefs and warriors were invited to meet at Fort Bowie. The gathered party was ambushed by soldiers after being dragged into a tent, and many individuals were killed. In punishment for the betrayal, Geronimo joined forces with 2 Apache tribes led by Cochise to attack a freight train. Number 4. Geronimo killed a Mexican general who gave a speech about the Red Devil. Despite being encircled on all sides by opposing troops, Geronimo managed to sneak inside the enemy encampment just in time for the Mexican general's address. Geronimo took aim and murdered the general where he stood just moments after giving this stirring speech, starting a conflict that allowed his Apache forces to flee into the adjacent mountains. Number 3. Geronimo had a serious crush on a United States general. Things seemed to be calming down in the early 1870s. After a long absence, Geronimo was able to lead his people back to their homeland in New Mexico, to Fort Bowie, the site of their betrayal by US soldiers years before. Geronimo spoke with the commander, General Oliver Otis Howard, a former Civil War officer known among his men as the Christian General, when he arrived. Even Geronimo wasn't immune. Howard always maintained his word with us and regarded us as brothers, he wrote. Number 2. In the early 1880s, Geronimo was ready to call it quits. Geronimo was fully at ease settling his people at Apache Pass after nearly 30 years of continual fighting. Things were violent between the white troops and the Indians living on the reserve in the years after General Howard's departure. Geronimo was once imprisoned for 4 months for taking a brief excursion. Every fatality, according to Geronimo, was the result of his tribe being continuously followed and attacked as he and his growing tribe escaped to safety. General Crook, the new commander of Fort Apache, instructed his forces to murder Geronimo if he resisted arrest. Because he had nowhere else to go, Geronimo eventually surrendered to US troops. Number 1. At 80 years old, Geronimo still wanted to keep fighting. Geronimo presided over the Apache's steady collapse in his final years. He had 8 wives by the end of his life, though he rarely married more than 1 at a time. He lived until February 1909, when he was thrown from a horse and left for an entire night in the rain before being discovered. He died of pneumonia a few days later. Geronimo's final words, according to witnesses at the scene, were regretful. "I should have never surrendered. I should have battled until I was the last man standing," says the narrator. I hoped you find this video helpful. If you liked the video, do like and subscribe as it really helps our channel, and do remember to give your feedback in the comments below. See you in the next video with some more interesting stories and facts.